All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, and we are ready to do this. You ready?
I am.
Okay. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Guy McPherson here, and I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Anne DePrince. Anne, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Guy. It's great to be here.
You are welcome. So Anne is a psychologist, distinguished university professor, and expert in intimate violence who believes change is possible. She invites you to discover your self-interest in working together to end violence against women and girls. Dr. DePrince has worked closely with victim service providers, police, prosecutors, and policymakers over more than 2 decades of research, an internationally recognized expert in violence against women, and studies the impact of multiple forms of violence against women: sexual assault, domestic violence, sex trafficking, adolescent dating violence, on a range of outcomes from health and economic well-being to education and safety. Her book is out. It's called Every 90 Seconds, and we will definitely talk about that. And welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you are from originally and where you are now.
I'm originally from Verona, New Jersey, and I made my way across the country for graduate school at the University of Oregon, and then landed in Denver, Colorado at the University of Denver.
Cool. All right. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, let's dive into this here. So a very intense topic, obviously. How the heck did you get into this field?
Yeah, what a great question. I have been passionate about this field since college. I was someone who went off to college with discovered quickly a passion for psychology, and connected that passion with advocacy work I was doing around sexual assault, gender and women's issues. And over time, I really leaned into that passion and that combination of trying to think about how we can use research as a means for social change, to make progress on the very important problem of violence against women.
So what drew you to the topic of sexual assault?
So I study sexual assault, domestic violence, as you said in your intro, a number of different forms of violence against women. I think in my formative years on a college campus, of course, sexual assault has persistently been a pressing issue. And in fact, the estimates of campus sexual assaults haven't changed in about 50 years.
Wow.
So I think you were hard pressed to find a generation of young women who haven't come through college experiences thinking or connecting in some way to the issue. So that was certainly one of the first entry points in terms of a growing political and scientific awareness of the problem of campus sexual assault. And then I was able to build that interest over time and see how it's not just about sexual assault. There are other ways and forms of intimate violence that impact children, girls, and women across the lifespan.
You know, I can't help but bring up the topic of the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial that's going on. I don't know if you're following that at all, but I have been. And from someone who is interested in psychology and more specifically trauma, it's very, very interesting. And it's very interesting to hear people's responses, lay people's responses to it. And I'm wondering if you want to comment on it at all in any capacity. And that's fine if you don't.
Yeah. Well, I think, not so much this case in particular, but when cases break through into public awareness and grab headlines, I think there are some common patterns that we see. We see a sort of vilifying of women, a question of what do they gain by making these allegations, and the assumption that there sort of is something to be gained. I think we also quickly are sort of pulled into a narrative that it's about, the issue is about people who abuse and people who are abused, when really violence against women is a problem for all of us in terms of the kinds of consequences it has in our communities and in our lives. And I think we can end up with some false dichotomies too that come out in this case, where it becomes about not commenting on this case in particular, but questions in this case around can men be victims of abuse as well? And they certainly can. And in my work, by focusing on women, it's not at all to take away from the experience of boys and men who've been abused, but rather it's to draw attention to this particular aspect of the problem of intimate violence.
I mean, but certainly on a more specific level, it is oftentimes about someone who is abusing someone else. And isn't it fair to say that women are more proportionally victims of intimate partner violence?
It's not only fair, it's scientifically accurate. So,
so it's proven.
Absolutely. And, that was part of my passion behind the book that you mentioned, that after all these years of trying to build awareness around the problem of violence against women, still about every 90 seconds, it's actually a little bit quicker than that. About every 90 seconds, a woman is sexually assaulted, another one is victimized by an intimate partner. And intimate violence knows no bounds of gender or different identities, but women and girls are victimized more frequently than boys and men.
Right. And is it scientifically proven that those perpetrators are more often than not male?
Correct. More often than not male.
What is going on? I mean, I'm shocked to hear you say, speaking about the campus situation, that things haven't changed in 50 years.
Yeah, it is shocking. And, I think you can look at research on different forms of violence, and we have seen gains of percentage points here and there. We're seeing other forms of violence on the increase in the last few years. So, for example, intimate partner homicides seem to be ticking up. But when you look at the whole of violence against women, I don't find compelling evidence that we're in a lot better situation than we were many years ago. Mm-hmm. And so what I've been thinking a lot about when you say you're shocked and how are we here, is that we have a lot more awareness, in fact, more awareness than probably at any other point in history about the scope of the problem. And it can feel like awareness is enough to cause change, and it's just not. Mm-hmm. And so we have to sort of figure out as communities a different way to approach change, recognizing that awareness is essential and it's not enough.
Mm-hmm. I was listening to, I have been following this trial, the Amber Heard and the Johnny Depp trial, and I have been listening to a YouTube show with a panel of lawyers who were commenting on it, and it was men and women, and it was very interesting. And I guess I was, for lack of a better word, shocked to hear their responses and attitude towards her, and kind of echoing what you were saying. How could she recall everything? How could she recall all these details? Why would she be saying these? Like, really, I couldn't believe why they just seemed so like against her. Like, why is she saying this? And I'm thinking to myself, here's someone I know something about trauma and can allow for the variegations in someone's memory and responses, but man, it's kind of scary to me.
Yeah, and that's what's happening to somebody high profile with a lot of cultural power and privilege. Imagine what happens to women who come forward every day without that power and privilege. Right. And I think what you're really getting at, Guy, is that we have a very narrow way that we as a society tolerate victims and survivors to behave. You have to remember enough, not too much and not too little. You have to show the right amount of affect, not seem too numbed out or too emotional.
And they were commenting on that too. Interesting.
Yeah. And so, Chanel Miller in her book about surviving sexual assault described it as needing to be the perfect victim. And these things have real world consequences. When you look at studies that have been done, for example, of processing of police reports of rape, when sexual assault allegations don't fit into our myths about sexual assault and about how a victim should behave, it's less likely that victims are taken seriously. That can have an impact one-to-one when people disclose, when they're met more with skepticism and disbelief than with responses around, how can I support you? What do you need?
You said that, we have these kind of beliefs, there are these myths. Why do they exist? How do they help us?
That's a really interesting question. I think some people, for example, psychiatrist Judith Herman, in her landmark book, Trauma and Recovery, talked about this tension between perpetrators and victims, and that essentially all perpetrators ask of us is that we look away. It doesn't cost us anything, or it doesn't seem to cost us anything to look away. But what victims ask of us is the world. They ask us to bear witness to something terrible, to bear witness to sort of the underbelly of humanity, of what we're capable of doing to each other. And they don't, victims, to listen to a victim and a survivor and authentically respond to what they're saying, it doesn't allow us to be neutral. And I think folks are, it's uncomfortable, and it's easier to turn away. It's easier to question a woman's motives and find ways to write a story that things aren't as bad as they might seem if we really had to sit with what happened. Yeah.
Wow. I've never heard it articulated like that. And I think that just resonates so powerfully. The perpetrator asks us to look away. What is that costing us? Really, it's so easy, right? But wow. And you use the word uncomfortable. I mean, I feel, to me, it's just stronger than that. It does speak to the horror that we're capable of, and some would say each of us, in our own humanity, is kind of capable of that, but not all of us perpetrates those kind of things. Oh, man, it's so friggin' crazy. Part of the reason why I started this podcast was because in one of my former positions, I was working with young individuals who were showing early signs of psychosis. And as part of our job each day, we would take these referral calls from parents and teachers and therapists. And so many of those callers didn't recognize what could potentially be traumatizing, that bullying could be traumatizing, or witnessing to domestic violence could be traumatizing. And that was it for me. I was like, this is crazy. I've got to get out there and do something. If awareness is maybe just the beginning, where do we need to go? How do we help?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. And I love the example you offered of realizing that something like witnessing domestic violence has consequences that ripple out either to a child's mental health or to other areas of their life. And I think therein is the answer, an answer of what do we do about the situation? Because I think what we have to do is recognize that violence against women is tangled up with the great public problems of our time, the things that we're trying to solve now, whether it's education access and success, healthcare costs, gun violence. At the root cause of those problems is violence against women. So, for example, you use the example of domestic violence. Children can witness violence perpetrated against a parent of any gender. Most often it's against a mother. And when kids go into classrooms after witnessing domestic violence, there are consequences. They have academic problems, they have problems focusing their attention, problems sitting still, things that can then ripple out and affect a classroom. And then over time, those education impacts can have an effect on that child's success later in school on through to their career. So suddenly we have a picture of not just something that happened on a Wednesday night, but things that have a ripple out to affect our communities, what that child ends up doing in terms of career and other things that affect our communities. And so it's a long way of saying, I think if we can begin to bring in allies from other movements to look at violence against women as something that we share an interest in working on together, then I think we have the opportunity to not only discover new solutions, but also to advocate and organize differently. And that's certainly one of the lessons we see in social movements and organizing efforts, that if you can bring more people to the table to see their shared interest in an issue that they initially thought wasn't their problem, you can get further faster. There are more wins that are possible.
So theoretically, what would that look like? What could that look like?
I think that could look like us finding ways to partner with people in our communities who are interested in gun reform. They may not be thinking about it through the lens of the number of women who die at the gun at a shot from an intimate partner. They might be thinking about it more in terms of mass shootings. Well, when you start looking at something like mass shootings, and particularly school shootings, there's among people who carry out those crimes, there's often a common link to violence against women or misogynistic views of the world. So suddenly, if we're working together and we're thinking about schools and gun violence and violence against women, new avenues to affect change in all of those areas might open up. For example, what if we really invested in healthy relationship education as early as possible in young people's trajectory? There's good evidence that things like talking to young people about gender expectations and relationships has a positive impact on their relationship development, their skillfulness, the likelihood that they think it's okay to beat up each other and assault each other. And so suddenly you have a different coalition that could work together to try to get that kind of programming into their schools and communities. So I think it's looking for coalitions such as that transcend a traditional issue area that's really important.
Why did you write the book, Every 90 Seconds?
I wrote the book because my own research has focused on violence against women broadly for years. And I feel like across milliseconds and memory, synapses and stories, I and my team have carefully cataloged the many ways that violence against women is bad. And sometimes research is necessary to affirm the obvious, that it is not good for an individual's health or our healthcare systems, for schools, for career achievement, for workplaces. Violence against women is not good for any of these things. And I got to the point, because my work does tend to look at different kinds of outcomes, and I work with a lot of multidisciplinary teams. I got to the point of really wanting to help people understand how violence against women is intersects with so many issues that they care about. So for people who might think, oh, that's a woman's issue, I'm not a woman, or that's a special interest issue, I haven't been abused and I wouldn't abuse anyone, I really wanted them to understand they've got a stake in us addressing this problem, because things they care about will get better too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. When I was reading your bio, I mean, when I read about or hear about violence against women, for lack of a better expression, it just makes me so sad. It just makes me so sad. And I know there's violence against men, and I know, men aren't the only perpetrators, but it's where you mentioned creating earlier education opportunities in terms of helping young people learn about relationships and healthy relationships. What are other avenues for education to help with this?
Yeah, well, I think it's about education. It's also about other resources. So one of the themes I deal with in the book is, there are a lot of ways we could define justice. One way to think about justice is the restoration of safety and choice. And the idea that when violence against women is happening or emerging in a relationship, that kind of the only choice we often have in communities is to call the police. Mm-hmm. That's not a particular choice. Mm-hmm. We know that things like housing insecurity, economic insecurity, those are factors that can increase the likelihood of violence against women occurring or reoccurring. So when we think about possible intervention points, things like people having access to stable housing, having food security, having support, career support, these are all violence against women prevention strategies. Having childcare, having paid time off, is a violence prevention strategy. So if violence happens and a victim or survivor can't take time off to go to court or to get a protection order, for example, we've missed an opportunity for secondary prevention. And so I think it's about not only the education points, but how do we think about the values of our societies, communities, workplaces, and the ways that they can be helping people to have the kind of security that prevents violence.
It's listening to you talk is very interesting because I hear you talking a lot about the systemic intervention points, the ramifications and the effects. And I, for whatever reason, maybe this is because of my own naivete, but I find myself drawn to, when thinking about this issue, this more specificity, the specifics of individuals who are committing and perpetrating this violence. And you're saying,
there's something there for you too. So I think, Guy, what you're getting at in part is we all have to find a place in this movement. Right. And what, as a psychologist trained to think about individuals, part of where I got frustrated with was I can work with individual, and that's not going to lead to system change. So my own journey has led me to be really interested in the system change piece. Mm-hmm. When you think about individual level change, there are really exciting interventions such as bystander interventions that teach people how to recognize signs and signals for intimate violence, harassment, aggression, how to not just recognize those, so not just awareness, but then what do you do about it? Building up the skills to intervene. So there's a lot that's there for folks too who are interested in working at that individual level, and that's essential also.
I want to go back to the college campus. I remember recently, I think maybe within the last 2 years, there was a documentary that had just come out. You know what I'm talking about? Which one I'm talking about?
Probably The Hunting Ground, perhaps?
The Hunting Ground. Yeah. And I was like, what? I mean, what is going on? I mean, in these college campuses such that things haven't changed for 50 years.
Yeah. And it's not I have many colleagues working hard on changing the landscape on college campuses, and it's incredibly important work. And as I said, I think we are moving the needle when it comes to awareness, and with awareness come more possibilities. For example, for talking with young people about consent when they get to campus, about intersecting health issues, relationship health, and so forth. But college campuses, they've often been a microcosm of our larger world, right? So it's hard to expect college campuses to be different when the larger world around them is one where violence against women has remained so common. So if you look at experiences that young people might have in high school, or things they may see out in popular culture, or all of those influences come with them to college. And so it's a little hard to expect the college environment to differ that much from the world around it.
Well, that's certainly depressing.
No,
I mean,
well, I don't want you to get depressed though, because
Well,
actually I think there's reason for optimism if we can find ways for people to engage this issue differently through their passions, like your passion is to work more individually, and then also to keep bringing in an ever growing network of people who used to think this wasn't their problem or their issue.
Mm-hmm. What do you say to and I know you're looking at probably through a much broader lens, but what would you say to women who are listening to this podcast?
I would say to women who are listening to this podcast that if you are a survivor, you are not alone, that this is not your problem to solve, that we certainly need survivor-centered, trauma-informed approaches to change. And this is not a women's issue. This is not a survivor's issue. This is for all of us to decide that we want to build communities that are different from the status quo. And so I would encourage them to think about in their own journey and their passions, how working on these issues connects to other passions, but especially for survivors, never through the lens of the responsibility falling on them to call for and push forward social change. That has to be all of us.
In terms of understanding, I know there's a incredibly long time between oftentimes when a woman is sexually assaulted to the time she reports. Has that changed over time?
Well, interestingly, we're sort of back to some of those myths that folks are quite skeptical of women who take a minute to make a choice about whether or not to report to law enforcement. People tend to believe women more if they reported right away. But for lots of women, that's just not how things unfold. It's a big decision to decide to call law enforcement and to enter into, for many women, a really unknown system. They haven't been part of that complex system before. We have seen in the research literature, there does seem to be an impact of Me Too, that when you ask, for example, there was a study of college students asking, using behaviorally defined questions to get at whether people had been sexually assaulted previously, and then using labels like, have you been raped? Have you been sexually assaulted? And from before to after Me Too really caught on as a way to build awareness about sexual assault, more students were willing to use those labels. Mm-hmm. The number of people assaulted hadn't changed. It was just how people were describing and understanding their experience. So that's another way that awareness does shift and create the potential for new action, because awareness campaigns such as Me Too, that movement, has really changed people's understanding of their own life stories, which when you understand your story differently and better, it gives you other new options for action and healing.
How do you interpret what has been going on culturally with the Me Too movement, and certainly with a lot of celebrities and sports stars coming out about their own experiences, their own mental health issues and so forth? How, if at all, has this impacted what you're seeing, what the research you're doing and so forth? Yeah,
I think these movements are incredibly important. So one of the things that my team has looked at over the years is different kinds of thoughts and emotions after traumas such as intimate violence. And one of the most striking things that we've seen is how common or how strongly feelings of alienation after trauma are in terms of being linked to multiple kinds of distress: PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, depression, dissociation. And there seems to be something about trauma and the way that it leaves people feeling disconnected and unmoored from themselves and from others, that we see in our research, whether we're looking at older adults or adolescents or survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence, that alienation is linked with more complicated and more severe distress. So when I think about something like Me Too, and part of its power, it's powerful in many ways, but part of its power is, I think, to retell the cultural story that people aren't alone. And certainly Tarana Burke, when she talks about when she started Me Too many moons ago, before any of us heard it as a hashtag, it was to signal to other women, me too, I've been assaulted also, I've been affected also. And that there's power in that, I think, for combating the kind of alienation that's so damaging after trauma.
So before we close out here, say a little bit more about the book. Who is your target audience? How might this help the therapists listening to the show?
Yeah, the book is written for a general audience who's interested in science and how it intersects with thinking about these issues. So it covers a lot of ground in terms of how to understand violence against women as it relates to the big public problems of our time: education, healthcare, gun violence, immigration, criminal legal reform, and economic justice. And through that lens of leaning into the complexity, all these places that violence against women gets tangled up with other problems, the book really, and I really came out on the other end with a spirit of optimism, in the sense that if it's this complicated, it means that we have a lot of ways in. Mm-hmm. We could sit back and be discouraged. It's too complicated. I can't do anything about it. But the flip side of that is we have new alliances we've never tried to build before. And so I hope, whether it's therapists or other listeners, that the book really is an invitation to think about your place in a movement to end violence against women through the issues that you're most passionate about. And the end of the book, which is, I think, one of my favorite parts of the book, really uses a concept from community organizer Adrienne Marie Brown of social change as science fiction, that we are essentially trying to imagine a world none of us has known. None of us has ever known a world without gender violence. And so we could say that's too audacious. We can't imagine that into existence. The flip side is, that's what social change has always been about, imagining a world that didn't exist. And we are certainly capable of that, particularly if we bring our passions together. So thinking, Guy, when you said that it's sort of sad and depressing, it is. And there's incredible potential here. And there's potential for people to show up to this, to a movement for social change in whatever way they'd like. There's many open doors, and that's what I take from the complexity of the issue. So please move through one of those doors is really the invitation of the book.
Well said, definitely. The book is Every 90 Seconds. We're talking with Dr. Anne DePrince. What is the best way for people to reach you, Anne?
You can reach me through my website, Anne DePrince, ANNEDEPRINCE.com.
Awesome. Well, you are certainly inspiring, and you're one of those people that I'm so glad are out there doing the work you're doing. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful, Guy.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.